Since 1785, the Times has been essential reading.
Now, it's essential listening.
Times Radio chooses conversation over confrontation.
Covers Westminster and beyond. Ask the right questions.
To keep you well informed.
We give words space and let the stories do the talking.
Listen on DAB radio, online, on your smart speaker or via our app.
I see we have questions already, I'm afraid. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's event. My name's Andrew Holgate. I'm the literary editor at the Sunday Times, and I'm delighted to be here at the second of 3 Sunday Times must-read events where we pick books that we think are particularly wonderful from the last year to interview Craig Brown about his utterly engrossing, and I could say that several times, utterly engrossing book 1, 2, 3, 4, The Beatles in Time. Now, Craig is the country's finest satirist and parodist and hardly needs introducing, but in the spirit of his book, can you hear me, everyone? Yeah. In the spirit of his book, which is kaleidoscopic and impressionistic, and which deservedly won last year's Baillie Gifford Prize, was a Sunday Times bestseller, and tells the story of the Fab Four in a wonderfully discursive way that jumps from lists to reminiscences to party invites to tours of famous Beatles sites. I'll tell you a few things about Craig. That he's a year older than me, that he's written 18 books, that he's written over 750 parodies for Private Eye.
Yeah, God.
And that he likes diaries and is actually, bizarrely, less keen on conventional biographies. He's also one of the country's greatest humorists and authors, and written in 1, 2, 3, 4, a book that Dominic Sandbrook said was ridiculously enjoyable, that Alexander Armstrong said was a work of genius, and that Sam Leith in The Spectator said was the most entertaining book about the Fab Four ever written. So,
can only be downhill from now.
Craig, the book was quite... I read somewhere recently that the book was written quite quickly for an anniversary. Is that right?
Yes, I was writing a book about the Thames, because I love walking the Thames. And so I got signed up to do this book, and actually I'd already walked it once. But I hadn't really worked out a way of writing about it, and I'd started to realise that the thing I liked about walking the Thames was that I wasn't writing about it. I mean, that it was a writing-free zone for me. And by chance, I did the last sort of section, sort of from around Kew, with my editor at Fourth Estate, the publishers. And I said to him, it had just come into my mind the day before, I've got a good idea for a book after this, a book about the Beatles. And he's a very good publisher. He's sort of saw dollar signs or whatever happens to publishers. And he then rang the next day saying he'd looked up and it was the 50th anniversary of the Beatles splitting up in April of last year. And could I get it in time to bring it out then? Publishers always, for some reason, like an anniversary, though it had when it came out, people wrote about it, but they didn't write about it because it was 50 years. But that meant that I had to write it fairly quickly. So I spent about 6 months researching and 9 months writing, I suppose.
And it is, of all the topics to choose, the Beatles are must be one of the most daunting for the sheer volume of material that has been written about them, and also for the passion of their fans.
Yes. I mean, there's an amazing... There are meant to be 1,000 books about the Beatles. So, even more than Henry VIII, or almost as many as Hitler, I suppose. those are the two big things. And a lot of them are very, very good. I mean, my last book was about Princess Margaret, and compared to royal books, books about the Beatles are really good, I think. Most royal books are terrible. And some, like Mark Lewison's, record almost every minute of their lives, so it's sort of encyclopedic. Mark Lewison's, I think, his first volume comes to 1,000 pages, and they've just released their first single. And so if you want that kind of book, that is a really good book. Then there are lots of books by people who knew them, or like Cynthia Lennon, John's first wife, wrote 2 autobiographies. His best friend at school, Pete Shotton, wrote one. And a lot of those, both Cynthia's and Pete's are very good. Their hairdresser, Leslie Cavendish, wrote an autobiography last year. I mean, there's virtually everyone who ever met them has written a book. And I just wanted to do something different, which is use all these books, good and bad, as my research. You know, so I almost employed them like researchers. And I wanted to convey the kind of fun and the excitement of the Beatles, and also put a bit of my own autobiography in, because I think somewhere in the book I say that when anyone talks about the Beatles, they talk about themselves. And so I wanted to sort of convey that. And, you know, I was, in 1967, I was 10 and at a Catholic boarding school, and just about listening to, you know, Sergeant Pepper, or later Abbey Road, or listening to Revolution No. 9, the worst of all Beatles tracks. A friend of mine, Charlie Miller, and I used to sit in this dark room, and it was actually called the Cavern. It was a sort of nightclub for little boys in the school, and we'd have this game of turning all the lights off and putting Revolution No. 9, which, if you remember, is number 9, number 9. It's just a sort of a noise collage, and it really spooked us out.
Yeah.
And we'd see if we can last the whole of the 8 minutes, however long it is, before running out screaming. And so just reminiscent. So I wanted to put everything in about the Beatles, and yet make it kind of compact.
Yes. Am I right in thinking that between the hardback and the paperback, you got quite a lot of people coming back to you and saying, I'm not sure you quite got that right?
Yes, I didn't. And some, I mean, there was only one kind of bad fault. I think it's got a lot of footnotes. And I said, now I'll get it wrong again, but there was this car crash with Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran or something like that, which was interesting because the policeman who came to the scene was, weirdly, was Dave Dee of Dave Dee, Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Titch. He later became Dave Dee's. Anyway, but I said that someone had died who'd only got badly injured, and so that's a bad mistake. And so I think that was the only really bad mistake.
It's just a way of alluding to the fact that there is such fervour, and people.
Yes.
I mean, at work, I have people, and I said about one particular track, and I said it got to number 1. And someone immediately jumped to me and said, no, it only got to number 2, actually.
And I got this is time for confession. I did get the name of a Bob Dylan album wrong.
Oh, well.
But I think those
I wasn't going to bring
those
that
things
up.
happen.
But one of the glories of the book is it's not a conventional biography. I have to tell you, I've just been judging. Craig won the Baillie Gifford Prize last year. I'm chairing the judges this year. And we had a conversation, and we said, oh, yeah, that's a Craig Brown type of book. Because it seems to me that what you have done with this is that you have, it's not a conventional biography, you have it's sort of almost restless melange of different ways of approaching it, and it's absolutely brilliant. And did you do that deliberately? You just you don't particularly like. I've read somewhere you don't particularly like conventional biography.
No, well, I mean, I read. Well, like you, you know, I review a lot of books. I review a book a week for the Mail on Sunday, and a lot of those are biographies, and a lot of them are very good biographies. But I do think there's something slightly bogus about the form of biography, and that even the longest biographies, say the recent Philip Roth one, which rather hit the skids, or Robert Caro's brilliant volumes about LBJ, however long they are, and they're both over, well, Caro's probably 3,000 pages now, and he hasn't got the last sort of 15 years of his life. but they're still nothing they're not as long as someone's life. So they're still artificial, even if you have every detail. It's still an artificial form which pretends to be the whole thing. And so I think there should be other approaches, and all my favourite biographies have taken other approaches. They either take a week in someone's life, or that sort of thing, or they play tricks of some kind. And also I have, I have a slight butterfly mind, and my attention span for the great-great-grandparents of, say John Lennon's great-great-grandfather, I'm not really interested. No. And that's always at the beginning of books, or almost always. And so you have this slight slog, I find.
Yeah.
And so I just thought, well, if I write only what interests me, then at least it'll be a book that I'd enjoy.
Yeah. And you alluded to something earlier on I wanted to come on to, which is about the different characters of the Beatles. They were all very different characters, yes, weren't they? And which is, I suppose, part of the attraction and part of what the early attraction of them. Anyway, and you have a brilliant bit, which Craig wanted to read out a couple of things, and I think it would be a good point at which to do this from very early on, about how we all have, well, I'll leave it to you.
Yes, so I was just keen, because I think sometimes in literary festivals, the thing that gets lost is the book. And so you have lots of conversation. And so I always think it's a bit like, knitting a perfect jersey, or what you see as a perfect jersey. And then you go to a literary festival, everyone asks you to unwind it. Anyway, this is actually chapter 2 in the book. It's sort of almost like an introduction, and it'll give you some idea of the flavour. Other groups had a front man. Your favourite was pre-selected for you. No one would ever pick Hank Marvin over Cliff Richard, say, or Mike Smith over Dave Clark. But with the Beatles, there was a choice. So you had to pick a favourite, and the one you picked said a lot about who you were. For their American fan, Carolyn C., there was, quote, Paul for those who preferred androgynous beauty, John for those who prized intellect and wit, George because he possessed that ineffable something we would later recognise as spiritual life, and Ringo, patron saint of fuck-ups the world over. In Liverpool, the 12-year-old Linda Grant, who later became a famous writer, favoured Ringo, quote, for reasons that are beyond me. There was, she recalls, a real goody two-shoes at school who liked Paul. George seemed a bit nothing. John seemed off-limits, too intimidating. Ringo was the Beatle for girls who lacked ambition. Picking him as your favourite suggested a touch of realism. It went without saying that the others were already taken, but you might just stand an outside chance with the drummer. If someone asked who my favourite was, I always said, oh, I like Ringo, remembered Fran Lebowitz, who grew up in New Jersey. I like the personality of Ringo Starr. I still do. He was not, of course, the favourite in my school among the girls. Paul McCartney was far and away the favourite. He was the cute Beatle, so it was probably just a contrarian position to choose Ringo Starr. Helen Shapiro was only 16, but already a major star when the Beatles toured as one of her supporting acts at the start of 1963. Like any other girl, she had her favourite. John was married, she said, but nobody knew about it at the time, so along with a few thousand other girls, I had a crush on him. George was the most serious. He would occasionally talk about what he was going to do when he was rich and try to pick my brains about the financial side of things. I couldn't have been a lot of help. I still wasn't interested in the money, but Paul remained the spokesman. Ringo was the quiet one. There was a Beatle to suit every taste. As a fan, you expressed yourself by picking one over the others. Each personified a different element. John Fire, Paul Water, George Air, Ringo Earth. Even their friends liked to paint them in primary colours with sharply contrasting characters, like one of those jokes about the Englishman, the Welshman, the Irishman and the Scotsman. Carolyn C. noted how in A Hard Day's Night they enacted their given personas. Winsome Paul, witty John, thoughtful George, goofy Ringo. The actor Victor Spinetti once told this story about them. While filming Help in Salzburg, he caught flu and was confined to bed. This is him talking. The Beatles came to my hotel room to visit. The first to arrive was George Harrison. He knocked, came in and said, "I've got to plump your pillows. Whenever anyone's ill in bed, they have to have their pillows plumped." He then plumped my pillows and left. John Lennon came in next and marched up and down barking, "Sieh Karl, Schweinhund! The doctors are here. They're coming to experiment upon you. Sieh Karl, Heil Hitler!" And he left. Ringo then came in, sat down by the bed, picked up the hotel menu and read out loud as if to a child. "Once upon a time there were 3 bears, Mummy Bear, Daddy Bear and Baby Bear." And then he left. Paul opened the door an inch, asked, "Is it catching?" "Yes," I said, on which he shut the door and I never saw him again. Paul was being the pragmatist, as usual. He knew, this is me, Paul was being the pragmatist, as usual. He knew that if he or the others had caught flu, there'd be no filming. I'd better skip, these are other people then talk about all the differences, particularly Jeff Emmerich, their engineer, who wrote a good book about them. But this is me giving a sort of summary. John was brittle, demanding and caustic. Paul emollient, engaging, agreeable. But there were those who detected something single-minded, perhaps even self-serving beneath Paul's charm. Tony Barrow, who worked as the Beatles press officer, felt that, quotes, "John made the most noise, especially with Epstein. But it was Paul who let John do the heavy lifting when there was a dispute with Brian. Then Paul would finish the persuasion. John would make Brian cry at times, but Paul, more of a politician, would use a quiet influence to get his way." Then I say, Paul was baby-faced, meticulous, perky, diplomatic, energetic, tuneful, ingratiating, optimistic, outgoing, cheery, sentimental, solicitous. John was angular, slapdash, maudlin, difficult, lazy, dissonant, edgy, sardonic, pessimistic, solipsistic, sulky, cool, brutal. Paul considered himself lovable. John believed himself unlovable. Paul once tried to explain how the two of them had become what they were. John, he said, because of his upbringing and his unstable family life, had to be hard, witty, always ready for the cover-up, ready for the riposte, ready with the sharp little witticism, whereas with my rather comfortable upbringing, a lot of family, a lot of people, very northern, cup of tea, love, my surface grew to be easygoing. Put people at their ease, chat to people, be nice. It's nice to be nice. Mentally, no one could say much to hurt me. Whereas with John, his dad wasn't home, so it was, "Where's your dad, you bastard?" And his mother lived with somebody, and that was called living in sin in those days. So there was another cheap shot against him. John had a lot to guard against, and it formed his personality. He was a very guarded person. He had massive hang-ups from his upbringing. But the peculiar power of the Beatles' music, its magic and its beauty, lies in the intermingling of these opposites. Other groups were raucous or reflective, progressive or traditional, solemn or upbeat, folksy or sexy or aggressive. But when you hear a Beatles album, you feel that all human life is there. As John saw it, when they were composing together, Paul provided a lightness and optimism, while I would always go for the sadness, the discords, a certain bluesy edge. It was this finely balanced push-me, pull-you tension that made their greatest music so expressive, capable of being both universal and particular at one and the same time. I think I better stop there, otherwise I'll
I'll ask the question now because I'm sure it'll be asked by our audience. Who would you like? Who do you like most?
Well, everyone, it seems always babyish, even at my advanced years, to have a favourite Beatle, but everyone does have a favourite Beatle, like the 11-year-olds had favourite Beatles then. And mine is Paul. I think slightly because I think he was hard done by, especially after John died in that awful way. That then John became the great hero. Everyone said, "Oh, well, John was the genius. Paul was just this sort of showman." But I think, first, I think Paul had the most amazing gift, or has the most amazing gift for melody. Also, I think his lyrics. If you think of Eleanor Rigby, for instance, you know, really beautiful lyric writer he could be. but also he was a kind of driving force. So they all acknowledged this, that Ringo and John, who lived very near each other in Sunningdale, they would always like just relaxing and lazing on the lawn and or maybe taking drugs or whatever. But they'd always be dreading this call from Paul saying, we should be in the studio, we should. And I think especially when it got more fractious, from sort of 68 onwards, and after Epstein died, it was Paul who, I think without Paul, you wouldn't have got those last 3 albums, just because, he irritated them quite a lot because he was so pushy, but he was so ambitious. And also, and one other point, I think that when he had this extraordinary good luck of having a girlfriend, Jane Asher, who was, obviously very nice and beautiful. So that was good luck in itself. But he went to live with her family for maybe 3 years in Wimpole Street in the centre of London, just next to Harley Street. And they were a very cultured family, and so they introduced him. Jane Asher's mother was taught at the Royal College of Music, and his father was an amazingly successful doctor who invented, among other things, he invented the term Munchausen's syndrome. So he's very eminent. And they brought a lot of culture into Paul's life, and because he lived in London, the others lived in the country, he went out to a lot of sort of avant-garde concerts, a lot of classical concerts, and so he took in all these influences, and then from him, that went through to John, who in a way played catch-up in those influences. But of course, then John did lots of interesting things with them as well. And so I think Paul, even though he's very popular now and obviously still very successful and keeping going, he has in some ways been underrated. So anyway, he's my nominee for favourite Beatle.
Well, one of the many brilliant things about the book is how you show just the extraordinary, and I'm old enough just about to remember, I was alive anyway, the extraordinary instant impact they had when they started going, particularly in America. And you have this brilliant moment with the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah, it was extraordinary.
And how profoundly it changed so many people's lives in 15 minutes.
Yes, it was. I mean, in England, it was sort of during 1963, basically, they became very, very famous. Cliff Richard had been, who we might talk about later, he was much more successful than the Beatles, before 63. He'd starred in films and things like that. But he'd gone to America and had flopped. And so Brian Epstein, an incredibly astute manager, had said, right, we're not going to go to America until they've got a #1 so that people will know who they are. And so they got the #1 in, I think, January 1964. And they went over to America a couple of months later. And he'd also very astutely, he'd said to the Ed Sullivan show, or to Ed Sullivan, who really organised his own show, that he could have them for virtually nothing. But as long as they had, I think, 3 weeks running on the Ed Sullivan Show and at the top of the bill. And so they were already people had already knew the song, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And so they were tuning in, and they already had girls ready to scream. But it was watched, I think, by 60 million people or something. And it was, and just everyone watched it, and it became a great generational divide, as the Beatles did anyway. Everyone remembered the next generation of pop stars, like Creedence Clearwater Revival or Bruce Springsteen. They all remembered, the parents walking out, slamming the door, saying, is that a girl or a boy? All those things that parents said at that time. And it just became a huge moment in American history. It also coincided with, it didn't coincide, but Kennedy had been assassinated in the November of '63. And so there was a terrible kind of funereal pall over America. And suddenly, it was like the sun suddenly coming out again. They were suddenly alive and optimistic. The Beatles in those days was just so kind of charming and so sort of full of freedom and fun, and they were so undaunted by America. So they got off the plane. You know, they really were still kids in those days. They were barely 20. And they were just so uncowed by, 200 hard-nosed pressmen asking them difficult questions. They just found the whole thing fun. And I think that came across, and that spirit of fun infected America.
And what also you bring out in the book is how they were sort of harbingers of change and sort of dragged change along, and how society seemed to change as they became more successful. Society seemed to change with them. You have a brilliant phrase, which is they were Pied Pipers leading their generation in a conga along an untrodden path, which I think is an absolutely brilliant phrase you use. And extraordinary social change that they sort of brought in.
Yes, and it's very hard to to gauge that. But, I remember I was only a child really, but, I was getting all the pop papers, so I was very immersed in the pop scene. And it was just, and I can't think of it happening ever again, that some people might dress up as goths or as punks, but it wasn't a whole generation. No. But in a way with the Beatles, a whole generation, if they grew beards, everyone their age would grow a beard, or that sort of thing. If they became interested in Indian religion, the hippie movement would swing towards that, and obviously musically, when the Beach Boys first heard, I think, I Want to Hold Your Hand, they never did a surfing song after that. They thought, no, we're yesterday. Surfing songs are yesterday. You've got to move on. So everyone was rushing after them in their wake, and that. And when those early songs are very sort of simple, they're very charming and sweet, like I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You. But they are simple. But as the Beatles progressed, so did rock all over the world, and it was an extraordinary thing. It was like kind of I don't really know much about Jung, but you felt it was some kind of collective unconscious. It was moving the world through them.
And you illustrate it in lots of different ways, but there's one moment, the social change and how they epitomise that, and the sort of the changing of the guard between the old guard and the new guard, and you call them the new aristocracy of the Beatles and the Stones and everyone else. There was, and I can't now remember where it was, but there was a moment where they were at a party, I think, and Princess Margaret came.
There was, I think it was at after the premiere of Help, I think, or Hard Day's Night. Anyway, it just showed, and especially I was interested in it particularly because my last book was about Princess Margaret, but it was a kind of changing of the guard or something. So first, at the premiere, as Princess Margaret and I think the Queen Mother came in, there were just people chanting, "We want the Beatles." This was completely unheard of before that. And around that time, we were talking earlier about it, there was a funny thing that in 1963, when the Beatles were touring England, they'd always know that when the people would be screaming after their set, but in those days, I remember it, you'd have the national anthem playing. And so the national anthem was played, and girls would literally stop screaming while the national anthem played, and then they would start screaming. After. An American reporter called Michael Brown showed that very clearly. Anyway, during the national anthem, the Beatles would then be able to rush out of wherever they were playing, de Montfort Hall in Leicester or whatever, because they'd have that clear 3 minutes where they could scoot off. But by 1964, that had stopped. They didn't have a chance. No one was bothering about the national anthem. They would carry on screaming. They would chase the Beatles. And so they couldn't have that escape route. Sorry, now I can't remember what your question was.
The thing was about the Princess Margaret.
Oh, yeah, the Princess Margaret, sorry. And and anyway, after the premiere of the film, they went to the Dorchester. And I think George was 20, I think. Maybe not even 20. But he was very hungry at this reception, and so he said to someone, when are we going to eat? And they said, well, royal protocol means you can't eat before Princess Margaret has left, because she was going on to something else. And so George just went up to her and said, excuse me, but we can't eat until you've left. And she said, you know, unlike her, she said, oh, yeah, of course, and then she scurried off. And this seemed a pivotal moment in British society when the 20-year-old working-class lad from Liverpool can tell Princess Margaret she's got to go. And she was ready to do it. And I think the world did change in those early Beatles years.
Yeah. Now, as they rise and become just this extraordinary phenomenon, early on it feels rather by accident rather than design. They do leave a lot of people in their wake, a lot of damage in their wake. I mean,
Yes,
a lot of
yes.
them don't seem to be able to help. But, I mean, one of them is Cliff Richard. You might as well deal with that
poor
now.
old Cliff. I mean, the thing is that, yes, there was a lot of the old guard. And, of course, Cliff Richard's actually only, he was, I can't remember if he was a week older or a week younger than John Lennon, but it is only a week. He's actually 81 today, rather amazing. But Cliff had been this huge star, and when Paul had his 21st birthday at his aunt's house in Liverpool, when the Beatles were just beginning to be famous, they were all really hoping. So there was a rumour went round that Cliff Richard would be coming, and this was sort of considered, you know, huge. But of course, the minute the Beatles became super famous, after I Want to Hold Your Hand, Cliff Richard was, you know, he was just yesterday, and he's never, you know, I think he's, as far as one can judge, a nice man. Cliff Richard, obviously very ambitious, but he never, I think he had one hit single in America, but never cracked America. And still, you know, he's fine in interviews talking about anything, but don't ask him about the Beatles, because he always said, you know, well, I had more number ones than they did, and that kind of thing. I've had hits in 5 decades, more than they, you know, and so I think people, you know, the success of the Beatles did upset people. I mean, more upset with people like Frank Sinatra or in England, Noel Coward. They just, you know, it must be very hard to, you know, to be Noel Coward, who came from a not dissimilar background to John Lennon, who was sort of, I mean, by the end, John Lennon was admitting that he wasn't working class, that the other Beatles saw him as the middle class one. So roughly Noel Coward's background. But of course, Noel Coward had developed this sort of aristocratic manner and the clipped tones, and had done very witty songs, and then suddenly he sees all this unraveling, and suddenly the world doesn't want that anymore, or, you know, the new world doesn't want that anymore. So you can understand why they were upset. I mean, there are other people left in their wake, like Pete Best, who the Beatles, you could say, had a personal responsibility.
The first drummer.
For him, yeah. And they, you know, they were basically, certainly 3 of them, maybe not Ringo quite so much. But of course, Ringo replaced Pete Best. But they were very, very ambitious. Yeah. I mean, particularly John and Paul, but also George Harrison. And I think that's a... And I felt that when I was listening to Jimmy Page talking yesterday, and you realised, you know, how very directed and ambitious he was. And he wasn't embarrassed about it, and it's a perfectly sensible thing to be. And in Bob Dylan's autobiography, you realise that. You know, they're very, very driven people. And I think John and Paul were driven, and they thought, for whatever reason, Pete Best didn't fit in, and Ringo Starr was actually more famous than them. You know, they were really pleased to have got him to leave his group. And everyone said, I'm not particularly musical, but everyone says actually, you know, Ringo Starr is a very underrated drummer. He has a particular technique which no other drummer has, and their engineer Jeff Emmerich said that often actually in the studios, and he didn't particularly like Ringo, I don't think, but he said often in the studio when they got stuck on a song, John and Paul, that by changing the drumming a bit, Ringo would galvanize something in their own creative imaginations. And suddenly the song would take on a new direction, and the correct direction. So none of them to be underrated.
I mean, I've got a long list of people who were sort of left in their wake, or lives were ruined by them, including the 2 comedians on the Ed Sullivan Show who were on just before them, who had an absolutely disastrous...
They were called Charlie and Mitzi, and I mean, I focus... One of the things which I think makes my book different from others is that there are people in it who are virtually not mentioned. I think these two aren't mentioned in any other book, Beatles book. They were sophisticated Los Angeles married couple, comedians called Charlie and Mitzi McCall. And they did kind of sophisticated Mike Nichols kind of humor. And they thought, hey, we got onto the Ed Sullivan show. They were very excited. And then as they were being driven to the theatre, they saw all these girls. And they thought, what are they doing this at the Ed Sullivan show? You know, it's usually, it had a kind of variety. It might have a ballerina and an opera singer and then a balladeer or whatever. And they hadn't heard of the Beatles. And of course, none of the studio had been filled with largely daughters of, you know, recording executives, or rather grandees. But they were a young audience who were there to scream at the Beatles, and they weren't there to listen to sophisticated humour. So this poor couple no one laughed. I think you can see it on YouTube. No one laughs. You can see that, you know, it just goes terribly. And they said their agent didn't contact them for 6 months after that. And so there are these awful stories. There's a key one. One of the longest chapters in the book is about a man called Jimmy Nicol, who only gets about 3 mentions in, say, Philip Norman's book about the Beatles. Actually, I think only 2. But he was a man who in June 1964, so Beatles at the height of their sort of early fame, they'd done America. They were about to set off on a tour of Sweden and then Australia, and suddenly Ringo gets very ill, has to go to hospital. I mean, he was a very sickly child before. This man, Jimmy Nicol, who was just playing as a session musician for Georgie fame, was rung up by George Martin saying, would you be able to be a Beatle starting tomorrow and go on the tour? And so he said yes. Hairdresser came round, gave him Beatles haircut. Taylor came round. He was a bit taller than the other Beatles. Made a Beatles suit for him. And so for 10 days, largely in Australia, he was a Beatle. He was all the press conferences. They treated him as one of their own. And he experienced that thrill of being a Beatle. You know, especially in New Zealand and Australia, people went completely wild for the Beatles. And it ruined his life. Ringo then got better. He was flown out to Sydney Airport at the same time as Jimmy Nicol was flown back. Jimmy Nicol got kind of ideas above his station, which you can imagine why. He left Georgie fame, started his own band, paid them too much. Anyway, he was bankrupt and divorced within the year. And people now don't know whether he's alive or dead. It's a bit like the Loch Ness Monster or something. There are sightings, and people think, no, it probably wasn't him. He went to Mexico and maybe in Amsterdam now. But you feel that if he hadn't had that call from George Martin, he'd have probably, you know, gone on to be a successful session musician or joined some other group. And so and that's not the Beatles' fault. He blamed it slightly on Brian Epstein. He thought Brian Epstein was trying to cold shoulder him, but there's no evidence for that. And I think Brian Epstein was a nice man. I don't think he would do that kind of thing. But you know, it's you know, part of the collateral damage, I suppose. Yes.
I realised I didn't tell you, if you want to ask a question, and we'll have time for a few questions, you can join at slido.com and just write something down and we'll try and get to it later on. 'Cause there's an awful lot to get through, and I realise we've only got 20 minutes left.
Yeah, sorry, I've been banging on too much.
But then it becomes a tragedy, doesn't it? The whole thing becomes absolutely ghastly later on.
Well, I'm friends with Eleanor Bron. In fact, I've performed with her, I think 2 or 3 times in Cheltenham. And of course, Eleanor was in Help and knew the Beatles well during that filming and loved filming with them. And she said all the cast and the crew loved the Beatles. And when she read the book, she said it had made her very upset because she hadn't realised the pressures they were under, which I hadn't hadn't really struck me while writing it, and it hadn't really struck me that I was writing about a sort of, you know, things disintegrating. And because in some ways I admire them for just getting through. I mean, the pressures on, they were all under the age of 30 by the time the Beatles broke up. You know, so it's younger than my son is now. And just to weather that amazing storm. Okay, they had amazing good fortune, but, you know, the pressures on them, which, you know, there are so many rock stars we know who've died from that pressure. And they basically, they were all survivors. Well, they all survived it. They went on, you know, all the Beatles albums have great music on them. They were carried on being creative. And of course, it was, you know, going from what you're saying, it was a journey from innocence to experience. Yes. That's the basic, you know, arc of the story. And for them, the experience, I have two pictures in the book on the same page, as kind of before and after. One of them is, I think they're being measured for Madame Tussauds, or having their hair cut all in a line, and you know, in about 63, 64, and they're all just look so cheerful. And then there's another one in about 1968, 69. They're all in a recording studio. You know, they look about 20 years older because of the fashion of the time. You know, everyone had long hair, beards. They look like almost like Ben Gunn or something. And they're always looking moody. I mean, obviously you can do that with photographs, but I think it had a general truth about it. They'd become jaded. I think they'd become tired. They were taking too many drugs. They'd had the awful tragedy of Brian Epstein dying, who was a kind of father figure to them. They were also, Paul actually, I didn't put it in the book, but I think it was with Oprah Winfrey about 5 years ago, he said an interesting thing, which was that she was talking about the breakup, and he said, well, they'd all go home or go out to parties singly and have people saying, oh, you're a genius. You know, people, not just girls by, you know, 68, 69, not just young girls, but, you know, people of my age and their age saw each one of them as a great genius, and they were sort of gurus for a generation. And so individually, they'd soak up all this praise, and they'd feel, you know, great about themselves. But then when they saw these friends they'd had since the age of, you know, 15 or 14 in George's case, it would be like going back to your family at Christmas and them knowing, you know, knowing where you'd come from. And he said that was one of the things, that they couldn't hide anything from each other, and they couldn't get the same praise from each other that they'd had from everyone else. Yes. And so you can see, there are lots of reasons. But I mean, it does mean that the disintegration and the fact that they split up in 1970, it does mean, selfishly as a writer, you have a beginning and a middle and an end. You know, whereas with the Rolling Stones, you know, the last famous Rolling Stones song was about 1983 or something, and they just carry on. You know, they do what they do very well, but it's a sort of like a slow fade, isn't it? Whereas, you know, the Beatles in such a short time had such a progression of songs and changed the world. And, you know, it sounds almost babyish to say change the world, but, you know, I have quotes from both Gorbachev and Putin, along with other people, but they both said to Paul separately, you know, that the Beatles' music, them growing up in Soviet Union, that the Beatles' music stood for freedom. And so whether you like the Beatles' music or not, they were sort of emblematic of so much more than just for musicians from Liverpool. So, you know, so I don't think it was such a terrible story. Obviously, things happened. They had so much experience in such a short time. But, you know, they achieved so much, and they survived it.
Yeah. I must say I felt very sad the further it went on. But
what did you feel particularly sad?
I just felt very sad that they succumbed to I mean, as you say, all that pressure, and they succumbed to it. And John in particular, I mean, he just sort of...
Yes, I mean, John...
He slightly just went completely off the rails. You have at one point, you have a moment where he's talking, you know, he's completely off his head on LSD most days, as far as from your description.
I mean, yeah, one of the extraordinary things I think is how amazingly energetic he was, given he was taking LSD, he was taking heroin, and yet he was still doing songs. He was doing almost an interview every day, going on the Frost show with Yoko, doing baggism. I mean, there's barely a day where he just is doing nothing. And of course, he does go off the rails. And I bet no one here has listened to Revolution Number 9 in the last 5 years. And he thought that that was the future of music at that stage. You know, he said to Paul, you know, this is our future.
Yeah.
And so, of course, he came back on the rails, you know.
But at one point you have this and you have to read it twice, where he suggests to Paul that they have a trepanning.
Oh, yeah.
As a fun thing to do.
I mean, it's a funny thing about John, that in some ways he was the most gullible. You know, you think of him as hard, and he always tried to show himself as hard and the tough one and cynical. But he was gullible, and he was sort of easily led. I got rather obsessed with this figure, Magic Alex Mardas. He was this Greek electrician. No more than an electrician, you know. And he had managed to convince John that he had a list of these inventions, like a paint which could make walls invisible. I mean, that sort of thing. New designs for recording studios. But, you know, and the Beatles, I think they gave him £2 million through Apple, their organisation. And, of course, he came up with nothing. And this was all, that was John-led. Yeah. People like George Martin, who, you know, older and wiser, knew that he was a charlatan. Yeah. And I think Paul and Ringo and George did. But it was John who was led up the garden path.
You are very nice. You're very generous to them all. The person you're not generous to is Yoko Ono. I mean, you're quite sharp.
And some people haven't liked that. I mean, while I was writing the book, first I didn't, I mean, in a way I didn't. She had to come in. Linda I hardly dealt with at all, just because I didn't really have anything to contribute about her. I mean, Yoko obviously is a figure in the Beatles thing. I don't blame her for the breakup of the Beatles. She's just one tiny element. But when I was writing it, I thought, well, shall I just do, you know, on the one hand, on the other? And I thought, no, you know, you write a book, a bit like Lionel Shriver was saying earlier. You write a book because you want to be honest about your feelings. It's silly to start sort of thinking, sort of PRing your own book and thinking, oh, well, I'd better, you know, not ostracize people. But I do think Yoko's a slightly, well, more than slightly absurd figure. And obviously she's a survivor, and so people, you know, love it. If at her age, you know, Alan Bennett once said, if you can suck an egg, people over the age of 80, people say you're a genius or something. But I just have a few, Lord, one of the troubles with my book is that I don't have an index to it, so it's not strictly chronological. So to find anything is quite difficult. And I've now. Oh, this is your copy.
Mine.
Oh, that's why I thought
it's
so. Sorry, every page had a fly leaf on it. Oh, here we are. Yeah, so I have little. Yeah, I mean, I actually do a long thing of comparing her with her songs with Shirley Temple's songs, and actually, in anyone who I'm sure there are Yoko supporters, but just as I was saying, I bet no one's listened to Revolution Number 9. I bet no one's listened to Yoko singing recently on the second side of Live Peace at Toronto. You know, that awful song, Don't Worry. I won't sing it for you, but it's a horrifying song. Don't worry, Kyoko, Mummy's only putting her hand in the snow. Anyway, these are things she says. And she still says this kind of thing on Twitter every day. Carry a bag of peas. Leave a pea wherever you go. Imagine, these came in her book of poems. Imagine letting a goldfish swim across the sky. Let it swim from west to the east, from the west to the east. Drink a litre of water. Anyway, she recently, in February 2019, she tweeted to everyone, give us some advice that will make our lives heal and shine. And I just thought, this is why I love being British. But people replied saying, with all these words of advice, one was, put Marmite on your cheese on toast before you put it under the grill. Another one said, the quickest way to change lines at Green Park is to ignore all the directions and head up the escalator to the ticket hall and down the relevant escalator to your chosen line. You're welcome. Another one says, a decent pair of oven gloves is worth 1,000 towels. And one says, if you're commuting from Barnsley to Sheffield, a McDonald's coffee is now 10 pence cheaper at Tankersley than at Meadowhall Retail Park. Anyway, so I had some fun with Yoko.
Yeah, very good, very good. So the book is absolutely packed full of incidental detail, and this is my last questions really, but one thing, you have this brilliant small chapter on relics.
Yes.
Or two chapters, I think, actually, isn't it, on relics. Extraordinary things, like a group photo of them is worth £29,000.
It is extraordinary. Yeah, I went to the last Beatles, or I suppose, yeah, it probably is the last because of COVID, Beatles convention, and they have a Beatles week in Liverpool, and part of it is this grand, slightly fading, or very fading hotel, the Adelphi at Liverpool. Is just packed with people selling stuff, and the prices I mean, I used to have Paul McCartney's signature. I stupidly lost it, but it's Paul McCartney's autograph, which is odd given that he's still alive and so therefore producing autographs. But it's the most expensive autograph in the world.
Really?
I mean, it's rather extraordinary. Yeah. But I have a chapter on a man called Dr. Zook, who John Lennon had, in about 65, I think, had a bad tooth taken out and had given it to his housekeeper, whose daughter was a big Beatles fan. Anyway, this was up for auction about, I don't know, late 1990s, and sold for, I think, £17,000. It's real. I've got a photograph of it in the book if you want to see it. It's just some horrid old tooth. Dr. Zook said, well, he was buying it for educational purposes. When he lectured, he was a Canadian dentist. And when he went around universities lecturing about dentistry, he was going to show John Lennon's tooth. Anyway, it later emerged that the reason he'd bought it was because he thought John Lennon would have a number of illegitimate children. And he wanted to get the DNA and then go halves with any claimant. Anyway, but people have got, another man bought a whole lot of John's hair because it was cut for, he was in the film called How I Won the War in about 66 or something. And he's had to have his hair cut for that. And his hair, someone bought a sort of bunch of his hair for what seemed like a huge amount. But now, each strand from that bunch, just one single hair is up. There's a place in Bristol, you can buy a single hair for £300. So, it's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. Right, a few questions. I'll probably only have time for a couple, I'm afraid, but and I'm going to combine two. I suspect you've been asked these before. What's your favourite Beatles song and why? And what's your favourite album?
My favourite album would be Abbey Road. I suppose the second side, though there are good songs on the great medley, which is actually the last. Especially with this new film coming out, because Let It Be came out after Abbey Road. I always think, oh well, it's the last album, but of course it wasn't because they recorded it before. But that is it's the last. The song called "The End" is the last track they recorded together, and I think that's a great album. And the song would be "Hey Jude" because John Updike said it was like the sun coming out on Easter morning, and there is an amazing sense of optimism about it. And I go into the whole business of lyrics. The lyrics, in a way, don't mean anything. I mean, some parts of them, like the movement you need is on your shoulder. Paul said to John, "We got to change that. You know, it doesn't mean anything." John said, "It doesn't matter if the lyrics don't mean anything. They come to mean things." And of course, they do. Like "I am the walrus" means, in a way, whatever you want it to mean, or nothing, or it's nonsense. But it has its own meaning. Anyway, I still, when I hear that Paul's voice singing those first sort of bars, you know, it just does make you tingle, and that's amazing.
Very quickly, you talk in the book about where Hey Jude came from, and I'm not having read a lot of Beatles stuff. I was really surprised, actually.
Yeah, it's a touching story. I mean, it's reasonably well known, but yeah. So Cynthia and John had just broken up, and Paul, in a funny way, had always been closer because he came from this sort of happy family, like I was saying before. And John hadn't. John didn't really. John's father was a complete sort of reprobate. John didn't really know how to be a father. He obviously grew later with Sean to know how to be a father. And so Paul was particularly fond of Julian, and he was, you know, he was worried about how Julian, who was then aged 5, I think, 5 or 6, and he was just driving down, I think to see Cynthia, I think. And he, in his car, just driving by himself, and this song came into his head, and so it was going to be "Hey Jules, don't take it bad," and maybe that's why it's such a touching song. Yeah. I mean, even if you don't know the reason behind it. And
John Lennon thought it was about him. Rather than
yeah. John, who was something of a solipsist, thought, "Oh, well, he's actually writing it about me," you know, but it wasn't. It was about Julian.
And last question, actually, I'm afraid. Actually, 2 questions. Actually, just one. Apologies. How critical was Epstein to the Beatles' success? You talk very movingly about Epstein.
Yeah, I do. I mean, in my book, I try to make each chapter different. Each chapter have a purpose. It has got 150 chapters, very short, most of them. But so everything has to have a point. And then I wanted to deal with Epstein because he's a completely fascinating figure. I'm sure when those of us who are at a certain age, you know, when we were growing up, I saw Epstein. It was always the grown-up. You know, he was seen. You know, he always had a sort of smart hairdo and sort of side parting, and always dressed in a suit. And he was obviously managing them, you know, incredibly well. But he was also taking far more drugs than John. His life was in complete state of disrepair. He was being blackmailed. It was a time when you could be put in prison for homosexuality. He had been arrested once. These people he was picking up were either beating him up or blackmailing him, and you know. And it was so he had a terrible, terrible life. And I'd better not go on too much about him. But I do. The last chapter is all about him, and it actually takes his. It goes in reverse from the time of his death to, and the book ends as the book begins, which is him walking down the steps of the cavern, the 17 steps of the cavern, starting 1, 2, 3, 4, which is the title of the book. Because at that moment, you know, if he hadn't walked down the cavern steps, I think the Beatles wouldn't have become this great phenomenon. You know, he had to really push to get their first record accepted, and then he completely masterminded it. He had no part of their music. He barely went into the studio, but he just managed their career and brushed them up and put them in suits and made them kind of acceptable to a huge swathe of people, rather than just people who were, you know, prepared to go down to the cavern at lunchtime in Liverpool. And so I think he had a major influence. But just going back to that last chapter, but as he was going down the cavern stairs, that moment, which was the making of the Beatles, and in some ways the making of him, it was also the unmaking of Brian Epstein, because in a way the least likely thing, as I was saying, all the 4 Beatles were survivors, but Brian Epstein wasn't a survivor. And so perhaps if he'd never discovered the Beatles, he'd have just been a successful part of his family business in Liverpool.
There we go. Slightly maudlin though. But we have to end, I'm afraid. Craig will be signing in the tent, in the Waterstones tent now. But I just want to thank you for coming up here.
Well, thank you
for being one of our must-reads. It is an absolutely sensational book. I've tried very hard not to go on and on.
No, please do. That's
so can we just put our hands together, please, for Craig Brown?
Thank you.
Like flowers cultivate in cracks in the concrete, culture grows in the spaces between the everyday. It's there in darkened rooms when the stage lights come on. It's in a park full of people belting out the same song. It happens in classrooms, having a go, hands-on. It's found in small circles, exchanging stories. It's under a tent, making brand new discoveries. It's in those shared experiences that help build communities. It inspires change, provides opportunities. It brings joy, sparks curiosity. It provokes feelings recognisable to everyone, making our hearts race and giving us goosebumps. It's for those who don't think they can have it. It's for those who know that they need it. It fosters connection and understanding. It is ours for the taking, as well as the sharing. Culture is what makes us human. It makes our world better. Culture is our culture. Let's explore it together.
Good morning. What a delight it is to be here. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Times and Sunday Times Cheltenham Literature Festival.
I should say that one of the consequences of COVID has been that I've lost most of the sight in my left eye and virtually all the hearing from my left ear. This one I wrote when I started to realise what had happened to me. I'm a traveller who reached the land of the dead. I broke the rule that said I had to stay. I crossed back over the water. I dodged the guard dog. I came out. I've returned.
This is the second book I published in a row in lockdown. It's such a relief with a solitary profession to occasionally realize that there are people out there who read your work.
I rewrite incessantly and I move things around because you've got to get the mood level, you know, all the way through. I feel you can't do whiplash stuff.
Labour's got such a challenge to win back Scotland, win back the north, win back places, you know, maybe not quite Cheltenham, but places like Cheltenham in the south of England.
Really, you can't call yourself a proper writer until you've done the difficult bit, which is inventing plot and character. The three abductors burst out of the car and found themselves outnumbered as four guys rushed out of the Turkish barbers, shouting to Gary, "Hey, you want some help?" Gary was pleased he used that barbers so often and tipped so generously.
When I work with a young person, immediately what I do is to pass on my vision on all levels. And that person must own my vision. And when he owns it or she owns it, I know we're a team, we succeed.
I've done tons and tons of birthday cakes. The great thing though, and this is what I would say to especially mums and dads who've never done this before, however bad it looks, if they've chosen it and you've cooked it. My son looked at that Coca-Cola cake and said, "Dad, it's the best cake anybody's ever made."